Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 432nd episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, joined by my co-host today, Abe. Abe, how you doing?
I am doing great. I had a fantastic time at SG Philly over the weekend, feeling all tired from playing Magic, but all rejuvenated in my soul. So,
I love that. Well, maybe we'll hear more about that later, but today we are going to be doing an episode all about getting ready for the RC. We're going to talk about some stuff revolving the metagame and whatnot, because probably going to hear this on Wednesday/Thursday, hopefully. So that should be exciting. And also there's some prep stuff there. But first, Abe, we do need to do Always Improving because it is the main point of the show. Also, if you're listening and you're like, oh, where's Spencer? Spencer is taking the week off for some personal stuff, so we'll have him back here next week. Abe, what was your Always Improving moment, though, over the last week?
So my Always Improving moment came down to a conversation that I had with Jonathan, a recurring character of my Always Improvings, as you might know. Jonathan Zukenik, who said something about specifically the red-black mid-range and blue-red Phoenix matchup in Pioneer from the red-black side, and thinking about like being on the draw as a Thoughtseize deck, like the value of that, and just like kind of getting into a corner of Magic where like thinking about how the play draw matters as in the play patterns more than just being on the play is always right, or like deviate from being on the play in the way you're like sideboarding or whatever, so you have a plan for being on the draw, but like embracing that idea to like how to leverage being on the draw in like the way you're playing and the way that you are sideboarding, or even if it's better or worse for you to be taking the draw even in a competitive format. I'm not entirely sold on it being right to be on the draw, but the way that he was sideboarding and the way that we'd talked about it specifically for that matchup, because he had decided to play red-black on like almost no practice and kind of like wing it at the SCG, really, really challenged for me like an idea of like just how Thoughtseize works and how a lot of parts of the mid-range deck works. So it was really, really interesting, and it's something that I'm going to be taking with me for a while, as it often is.
Okay, so this is really crazy. This was something that I had planned to talk about after the RC, because I'm working with some people for the RC, and there's some amount of like wanting to keep things close, whatever. And however I feel about that, I've agreed to work with people, and that is what it is, right? Like I've agreed to do a thing, so no matter how I feel about it, I'm not going to talk about it. However, this was my idea, so I'm going to leak it, especially since I don't think we're going to end up doing it. It's so funny you mentioned that. When playing the Phoenix versus red-black, I proposed that we're supposed to take the draw as Phoenix.
That's so insane to me.
Unironic.
So insane to me because I think you're right.
Yeah.
Like I think after taking the draw with Phoenix, or taking the draw with Rakdos against Phoenix like 2 or 3 times over the course of the weekend, after having this conversation with Jonathan, because I was like, you know what? I'll try it. I was losing I was testing with Ben Nikolic because he was playing Phoenix. We were just like jamming games at Jonathan's apartment. And I just kept on losing. He was like, then during the tournament, he was like, yeah, I just beat red-black every time. I've been choosing the draw. This is how I'm sideboarding. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to try that. I can't win with anything else. This match was like getting really hard for me with the way their deck's currently built. And then I was just winning, and it made a lot of sense. But I was like, I don't know. I need to test it a lot more before I go on the record being like, being on the draw is great. But the fact that you're telling me that you think from the other side that's correct, there you go. You can, if you only got this out of the episode and you're pulling the RC, you're already so far ahead of the game. This is the highest value episode of CC for the RC.
I don't know if you were looking at my face, but I was just like, did I talk to Abe about this already? I was like, I didn't talk to Abe about this. This was like a Friday idea. He was at the SCG. Yeah, so I'll just talk about it too, because that was the whole point of it, like a whole thing, and it's probably a better Always Improving moment. So from when we were sitting playing the Phoenix deck, part of the problem was by going first, all of your cards play into their reactive cards, right? Which seems to be kind of what Zukenik's talking about, where it's like, so if you leave in your shredders and you decide to do that, we're playing thinking the guys says whatever your 2-drop is, you're playing into their push and to let them develop a threat. And depending on where you land on Misery Shadow in the new format too, they might have more 2-drops, or there's still 2 Tenacious Underdogs to 1 Tenacious Underdog. So like you're playing in and letting them develop, and then you probably go pieces of the puzzle, and then they go blank. And so now they're countering everything you do. on like a perfect curve with both players having their best draws, right? Whereas if you and that was like a problem just in general, was like we were piecing and then go blank was causing us a problem. So I was like, what if we took the draw, we just like held on to everything as much as we could, and then basically use pieces of the puzzle as a counterspell to go blank, as long as we have any other play possible. Obviously don't waste your turns or whatever, but if you like could do something that's like pretty impactful, do that instead, then cast pieces after they go blank you to punish the go blank. And just kind of like strand them. And then at end of turn set up like opt, connive, put these in the yard, spend 4 mana, draw 3 off treasure cruise. You don't need to do that much to actually win. And that was like the whole thesis of my like plan, because we were like having people play Rakdos versus Phoenix and they were just losing over and over again to Rakdos and involving some weird sideboarding stuff and whatnot. And then doing this, I think it actually helps a good bit. I'm not 1,000% sure it's right, but after hearing from your side too, I'm starting to think we're more right than we are wrong. And if it's not right, it is not wrong by so much. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to debrief after the episode on this one. Because this is... This is too much of a coincidence. I can't... I'm shook. I'm shook to my core.
Yeah, that's really funny. This is one of the things that I was like, yeah, we'll talk about. Because there's like... I mean, even on Friday, I kind of have a Twitter thread of things that are like, these are things we didn't do. These are things, ideas we had or whatever. And maybe this one can't be on the Twitter thread or whatever. I don't know. I guess it's on the episode, so it's fine. But it's like, there's a bunch of things I think are really interesting and a lot of thoughts and ideas that are challenged in Pioneer, I think, after having played a bunch of Pioneer and trying really to succeed and do well with the format, that I can't tell if I'm lost in the sauce and I'm just like coping, or if like it's true and people are just not acting that way in public settings. You know what I mean? Like for example, I still think green's one of the best decks by like a large margin, but I think some of the things that I've seen around the format in relation to that are not as clear cut as I think people have made them out to be, which is I think always true. Pioneer's been more explored, but a little underexplored with a critical eye. And I'm going to be super interested once all the RCs are done across the world to see what Pioneer looks like. Because I think it's going to look fairly different than it is now, but not like drastically different, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that just having high level Pioneer play occur for like like you're basically gonna have how many regions are there? Like 5, 7 regions or something?
Us, Canada, APAC, Europe. I think there's one more. So there's 5.
Yeah, so like there's gonna be basically like 5 big GPs worth of like really intense high level Pioneer played. 5 good results, which is more intense paper play than there has been in the last 3 years for any format.
Yeah, and I mean, also just talking about the RCs, and we've had this conversation off show, I think. I don't know if you had it on show, but in a lot of ways, they are the regional Pro Tours level of like player and caliber and thing you can expect from right before the pandemic. And we saw how different Pioneer looked just with that. Now, the Pioneer format was much younger at the time, but it looked really different after the first regional Pro Tour in Europe to the one in the States in Arizona to the next one in the APAC region. And the format moved really quickly. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see if the format can move as quickly now and kind of what will come out of it. Because I mean, I'll just say this doesn't really matter, especially with how like the episode's coming out. And if they're a CC listener, it's fine. But like the Kruger's Fire deck, I think is really good actually. But it has like a big mono green problem. And the way I'm seeing a lot of people build Kruger Fires only exacerbates that problem. And like the version that I have that I almost played for the RC, and technically still could, is like very different than their deck. It is like 9 to 10 cards different. And I just keep seeing people copy pasting these same mana bases and these same threats. And it just feels like it's wrong. And they're not even trying to fix that matchup. And I don't know. It's just like the things that I did differently don't make your deck worse against all the other decks. They just make your deck play on curve better. And so I don't know. It's just really weird. And it's one of those things where, and I know you experienced this before, the Pro Tour before and stuff, where it's like, are we just stupid? Are we like overestimating these decks? Or is this actually a meaningful difference in the deck?
Yeah.
So that's what my always bring moment is, that kind of stuff.
It'll be really, really cool to see it all shake out. But
yeah. Regardless, though, we do want to thank our sponsor, Game Grid Lehigh. If you want to go and support the show, buying cards from them is one of the best ways to do it. If you might be having RC a type event, like an RCQ coming up, you can go there, use the code in the show description in order to get 10% off. It's going to be super awesome. They're a big supporter of the show. They helped us a bunch and are helping put on our standard tournament. If you're a diamond level patron, which is the $10 tier, you get into that tournament for free. The tournament is just $10 to enter, and it's standard on Arena December 3rd. So that is super exciting. There's going to be a lot going on there. If you're going to enter that event, you might as well just join the Patreon and get the other benefits and stuff like that too. But, you're happy to enter that. Normally, you can find it on M2G Melee and on our Patreon if you're a member of $10 or more there. And just in general, the Patreon is a great way to support the show. The show will always be free, but if you wanted, to give a little bit more or something like that, or maybe think you might get something out of the tiers and bonuses stuff going with it, definitely want to check that out. Some of the cool bonuses are access to the Discord, where there's a lot of people talking often. There's bonus episodes. Abe and I recorded one last week, actually, where we went over some stuff for the Brothers War and answered some questions from listeners. So it's kind of the bonus episodes are typically like a topic plus extra Patreon questions. And the Patreon questions are something that gets on the show each week. So that's a way to get your kind of thoughts and vibe checks on the show. And if you don't get them there, you get them in the Patreon only episode each month. So if you want to support the show, it's a great way to do it. But, Abe, I think it is time to talk about our main topic. And that's everything you need to know for the RC. We've already kind of talked about it a little bit. We talked about a little bit about Phoenix and stuff. But we're going to kind of talk about a couple decks here, listeners, and go over them. And then we're going to go over a couple other things and hopefully help get you ready for the RC if you haven't had too much time to prepare with people, or maybe you're going down to LCQ or something like that. So, Abe, I want to start with Rakdos. This is the deck you just played in the SCG this past weekend. I know you've worked on a bunch. And when we last talked about Pioneer in a big way, we did our mega ranking show. Rakdos was the most successful deck on MTGO at the time. And I think it's basically that and green are still 1 and 2 in some order. So what do you think about Rakdos? Do you still feel like it's really good? What do you feel about it going into Brothers War, etc.?
Yeah, I think Rakdos is still like a very, very good deck for the format. It's something that has game in every matchup. I'm starting to cool off a bit on how close the matchup is with green. I think that as the green pilots have gotten better and their plans for beating things like Extinction Event, and the way that they're like using their flex spots and stuff, as those have hammered out to be like either Sky Sovereigns or what have you, have as that's become more of the plan, they've gotten much better at dwarfing what red black is doing, and that's been a bit of a problem. But when it's not green, there's just so many decks in the format where Rakdos gives you, I feel, advantage playing the matchup, or I feel at least not more than like a half step behind, and so on any given Sunday, I would never be surprised to see Rakdos win still. I still think it's the deck that, if I were qualified and playing the RC, I would just bring in play. I think it gains a lot from Misery Shadow. Like, structurally, I think that card will change a lot about some of the issues that I have with playing Rakdos. I think like its threats are some of the weakest parts of it, and this card I think will be a really, really potent threat for it. But yeah, it's really just a bread and butter, Thoughtseize and cards that generate card advantage, ways to pick apart the opponent and kind of dissect any game plan, good ways to interact. Gets to play 4 Bone Crusher Giant, which is still one of the best cards in the format, and you really just do have a lot of game against just about everything. So
I agree with all that. And I think it is hard to undersell how good Bone Crusher Giant is, and I feel like we haven't talked about it enough on the show, where that card is basically like the best anti-aggro card in all of Pioneer, and it's like fail rate in your deck is like shock the control deck into turn, play a 4/3 go. And so it's just very strong, and it basically always 2 for winning your aggro opponents. Really does help Rakdos kind of stabilize and lock up games in a way that I think if you just kind of quickly glance at the deck and haven't played it much, maybe doesn't quite seem as true as people say it is. You think like, oh, maybe your Thoughtseize need to line up more. Maybe, you have to line up these Dread Boars. And there's some extent of that being true. Bone Crusher Giant just honestly demolishes so many decks in the format. So
yeah, something that I heard said a lot over the weekend was that there were Pioneer players who were like, I really like Pioneer sometimes, but I feel like all the decks, except for Rakdos, just have these games where the deck just draws and just doesn't function. And Rakdos kind of has, like, it's not doing anything super powerful like a lot of these other decks are, because there are draws you have with just about every other deck in the format where you're like, this deck's unbeatable. it's the most powerful thing. It can beat anything if I draw like this. But then it has draws where it just does not seem functional. Rakdos never has that issue. Its mana is really good because you're a very base black deck with like a few red cards you need to cast. You only need one red source. And you have to play a ton of utility lands. So you're never really flooded. You have a lot of ways to make sure you hit your land drops. And a lot of your interaction spells are really cheap. So you take the game long enough, you draw enough lands to like really play a game. But your cards are never really individually that powerful, such that they're doing anything unfair. So and that's really the biggest trade-off to me, is that if you're someone who like does not want to play games where you feel like you're just losing your deck, not doing its thing, Rakdos never doesn't do its thing. Rakdos only ever really loses when the opponent's deck gets to do its thing, because it doesn't disrupt it well.
And that is one of also the big selling points of Rakdos, is you mentioned how it kind of always does its thing, but also it's pretty good at breaking up things. So if your opponent's deck, like you mentioned in Pioneer, they're all kind of 2 cards away from being like a bad Modern deck, right? But a bad Modern deck would be the best deck in Pioneer. So it's kind of like, okay, if I can Thoughtseize or, Stomp if your deck's weak to that, I can do these sort of things to break you up and kind of pressure you quickly. Then your deck kind of just falls apart. Sort of in the vein of like the mono black aggro deck that we saw at the beginning of Pioneer, where it had like Thoughtseize, Smuggler's Copter. And that deck killed much quicker than the Rakdos deck does and couldn't grind quite as much. But kind of a similar idea of like, my creatures have a low fail rate. I kill you all the time. I disrupt you a little bit. So I think that is a good way to describe Rakdos, how you did there, Abe, where it's just doesn't really fall apart. I think mono white, if you want to go into that one real quick here, a little out of order, I think is a very similar style, where the mono white deck, I don't think is actually strong in a lot of ways. I think it is strong because it has a low fail rate, and it kind of just consistently does its thing and pressures the opponent. And much like Rakdos, that is sort of the angle in which it's trying to do, where it's like, hey, my deck kind of always functions. I always kind of put some pressure on you. And, if you stumble too much, something like Thalia, or a couple of Thalia's lieutenants are going to just run you over, and you can't afford to have that sort of stumble. But what do you think about white? Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, definitely. I think that between having Brave the Elements as this like huge way to push through decks that try to stabilize against just the I'm going to curve out games that mono white has, as well as breaking through specifically like the mono green Portal, or even just doing something like protecting an Adeline from a removal spell can be like make or break. But really, just like you said, creatures have a low fail rate. The deck is just a bunch of creatures. Thalia is Thalia is like the epitome of the card that punishes your deck for being a little clunky or drawing a little weird sometimes. Because as soon as your spells stop lining up on curve, if your deck's not really efficient and built to handle that, the whole game's going to spiral out of control, and you're going to take an extra 5 damage in a combat that you couldn't afford to take because you had to spend your whole turn as opposed to 2 spelling on a pivotal turn. And that's enough for all of the efficient creatures in white to really capitalize on. And I think that, there's a bunch of really, really cute ways to attack the format, but this is a very classic way to attack the format that does really put all of your opponent's draws to the test. Even in the matchups where, even against Rakdos, where Rakdos is pretty favored in the matchup because their deck is built to beat a deck like mono white, you still have a ton of game because of the mid-range problem, where you're not going to draw always the right set of cards to answer what's going on the opponent's side. And on top of that, things like Thalia or things like Brave the Elements can really just punch a hole in what you're trying to do to interact with, and make the game impossible to rein in. So yeah, I think that mono white is another one of those decks that doesn't fall apart to itself so much as it does it falls apart because it's a white weenie deck and at a certain point gets outclassed, as opposed to, I didn't draw the right card. I didn't draw, my card that takes my deck over the top in the way that something like mono green, not ever drawing a Nykthos or not ever hitting a Storm the Festal or a Cavalier to really go off might have.
100%. White, I think, for its we kind of negged on it a little bit there, but I do think it is good. Having a low fail rate and being proactive is a fine place to be. It's not high on my personal list of things I would play for the RC, but it is still a totally reasonable choice. And I would be very hesitant of anyone that were to laugh someone out of the room for playing that deck. Well, I don't think it's the best thing you could play, I think that's mono green, which we'll get into in a second. It is just totally reasonable and like a totally fine place to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, Kellen, friend of the show, Kellen Pastor, he played mono white. He asked me if you should play the big mono white deck or the little mono white deck on Friday, and I was like, you should absolutely play the little mono white deck, and he very easily like ran it up and made it all the way. I think all the way to the top 8 before he lost to Greasefang. But you know, like the deck is really good, and it does just put all of your opponents to the test. And if you're playing it well, there's a ton of room to begin. I would not ever discount it and never, you know, treat it as a joke, because it is really seriously a very strong proactive deck.
But we can't avoid the elephant in the room anymore. We can't talk about jokes and proactive decks without talking about mono green devotion. And Abe, I'm kind of curious to hear what you have to think about mono green devotion. You kind of mentioned how you feel like maybe that match with Rakdos has changed a little bit. Have your thoughts on green changed much? Where were you? Because when we last talked on the show, all three of us were really high on this deck and Rakdos as like kind of 1A and 1B of the format, depending on the week. And how has that changed for you? Is that the same or?
Yeah, I think I still find green to be the 1A. I think that it has the lowest fail rate of all the decks that do something really powerful, and also the ceiling on the powerful thing it's doing is really high. Like, there are a lot of matchups where even if you're playing against another combo deck, you might just out combo them, even though you don't really interact well, because there aren't any decks that really do a lot of interacting well and a lot of unfair things. And specifically as far as like the Rakdos green matchup is played out, I think it might change a little bit towards like swinging back a little bit towards Rakdos with Misery's Shadow, giving another way to exile some of the big creatures, with like Old Growth Troll having a Dice trigger that's very relevant, and Cavalier of Thorns having a Dice trigger that's very relevant. Both of those getting shut off by Misery Shadow's static ability, I think, might bring it back. But the green deck, just at a certain point, once it gets to 5 or 6 mana, has so many live top decks that just put so much in play for the opponent to deal with that it really does control and dictate the pace of the game by putting out problems. And you know, it also gets to play 8 Llanowar Elves, which is just the best way to start a game in the format. It plays a ton of really resilient mana sources, and like Kiora is a card that a lot of times people have to take an entire like 2 turns off to get off the board, just because the value of you having 1 more mana, or if you find that Nykthos 100 more mana, you know, that's so important to be able to deny you that it's really, really hard to contain. So I think that this is, and you know, until something really drastic changes, is probably the 1A of the format. Its biggest weakness is the proactive decks, but the proactive decks, like mono white, you know, like I said, they kind of have a cap on what they can do and what they can handle. And some of the decks between, like on the spectrum between white and green, as far as where they land, are just so good against those proactive decks that really are structurally built to be good against mono green, that it's hard to feel like mono green is really going to stay pushed out forever. But there are definitely times where mono green will not be correct, and especially something like an RC where it's known how good mono green is, and everyone can kind of expect that mono green will be a very, very popular deck that people will just go to because it is the best thing. How many people respond to that by bringing something that is giving up at somewhere in the middle, but really targeting beating mono green, is really a big question mark for the event itself. I don't know how you feel about that, Mason.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think that is bringing up a good point of like the mono green deck is very known. Even the like innovation stuff, I think, is pretty on the table. Like Stonebrain, Cityscape Leveler, Woodcutter. Those are all cards I think are very obvious to players. So it's not even like, oh, you have some new cyborg tech that's really throwing people off. And even the main deck tech of things like Nico Bolas, Dragon God, in order to get edges in the mirror post Stonebrain, I think is all really obvious. And we see a good amount of people talking about it already. And I think that a lot of those changes make the deck kind of worse against these aggro decks that are just trying to pressure the green players and like try and hit that fail rate and then push through some big burst of damage. I think typically with like Brave the Elements is kind of the way that's happening a lot. And I think that it does stand to reason that playing mono green is not 100% the slam dunk choice I think some people think it is. Personally, I am kind of between mono green and Phoenix and a little bit of Fires, but mostly those 2 decks. And my kind of thoughts when it comes to like listening to hear you say this and kind of listening to the show, what I say to someone is mono green, despite its problems, if you are on the play and have Elf into Old Growth Troll against aggro decks or Elf into Cure against value decks, it is very hard to ever lose those games if the rest of your draws line up pretty reasonably. And that involves being on the play and involves a fair bit of it. But no matter how prepared their deck is, it's going to be really hard for them to consistently stop what you're doing. And you are consistently the most powerful top-end deck of any deck in the format. Whatever everyone's trying to do, they really can't be stronger than you without giving up something huge in some area of their matchups, like something like Lotus Field maybe, where they kind of fold to a single card. So I do think it is reasonable to not play mono green in the tournament, but I also think that it is going to be probably the deck with, like, for example, I would guess there's a minimum of 2 mono green players in the top 8 of the RC this weekend. Like, that's the minimum, and I would expect it to have a high conversion rate today too, and a fine success rate. But I do think that it is going to, if you are not a strong pilot at attacking and blocking and sequencing, you are maybe doing yourself a disservice picking that deck, because there are going to be people who are coming in with real plans to beat you, and if you don't have something to stop that, where you aren't prepared for that, you might fall behind the 8 ball a little bit.
Yeah, and I think something else that, my last thing I want to say about green is that you think about it as a combo deck, but really because all of its cards are so, like, they generate so much independent value, or they are, or they're Llanowar Elves, and they're so important to answer. The deck is really, really resilient to kind of just a little bit of interaction, which is the way that a lot of decks try to get away with beating some of the more unfair decks in the format. Like Rakdos, for example, part of the reason I think that this matchup specifically is so tough is because you have just a little bit of interaction for a while, and you're like, okay, I finally got the game to a point where I kind of have them contained. I just need them to, like, kind of miss on a draw or two, and then I can really have control of the game. There's just so many draws in the mono green deck once they have their mana that are those heater draws that really put the game back in their possession. It's the biggest strength of the deck. It's what really sets it apart.
Also, with mentioning, it is like a combo deck a lot of the time, but it's like fail rate medium plan is often just like large stated creatures ahead of curve. And that actually does go the distance in a fair bit of games, or force your opponent to just like sit back stabilizing and not pushing you. And so sometimes you get your opponent down to like 8-7 life, and they're ahead on board by so much, but they can't start really attacking into you because your creatures are so much bigger than their creatures. And if they start attacking full out, well, you don't have any removal, but you're going to have to start abyssing. And it just becomes really hard to, like, all right, sacrifice one of my best creatures on the attack, sacrifice one of my worst creatures on the block, and then it's just, you fall so far behind. So green deck, very good. If you're playing the green deck this weekend, I think, and even if you feel like you couldn't answer my question that I asked earlier with super confidence, I would be hard pressed to say playing anything else. I think you have to be really confident in your plans and everything to play anything else. If you're already going to play green versus something, which is where a lot of the indecisiveness personally comes. Before we get to the other deck, I was going to talk about probably the other deck that's kind of, and what's one thing worth mentioning too, and we're talking about both these decks, is Mono Green is like one of the decks that is only one card away from being a bad modern deck, and the other deck is Greasefang, where both those decks just kind of need one more card, and they're kind of bad modern decks, right? Like we talked about before, and like that would be like the best thing in Pioneer. Mono Green is like got these weird flex slots that it kind of needs like something really good to kind of fill the deck out, and then really it's just sideboard stuff. And Greasefang is kind of one card away from being a consistent card to add to the deck for enabling it that has a low fail rate. And the Greasefang deck has consistently proven to be one of the best proactive things in the format. While it does have kind of an awkward matchup against the card and the Great Creator, we've seen time and time again how it can overcome that. And just in general, on the play, if you go like nothing, like Thoughtseize your opponent or whatever, replace your supplier, doesn't really matter, into like State of Wayfinder into Greasefang, that sort of draw will overpower your mono green opponents, even if they have Karn a lot of the time. And basically, everyone else in the format can't keep up with that if it resolves. So I don't know how you feel about Greasefang.
Yeah, I think Greasefang is the best of the decks that seeks to get under mono green without having to engage in like the ways that like the get under them decks, the kind of the aggressive decks really usually try to engage. It's like very good against Bone Crusher Giant while still being in that space of trying to end the game before it really gets to that stage that a lot of decks needed to get to. I will say that Greasefang was one of the early contenders for like, oh, this is just gonna be the best thing to do in Pioneer. It's super strong. It's just about finding the best Greasefang deck. And then Greasefang really became something that Red Black actually is the perfect kind of response to, because containing them is on an easy dimension to handle for the Red Black deck. So this is where the rock paper scissors of the format really starts to show itself, in my opinion. Is like green is kind of it's advantaged against Red Black, but kind of weak to these strategies trying to beat it. Red Black is good against a lot of these strategies that are trying to exploit green, and then there's a lot more complex dimensions we haven't really talked about in all of the other parts of Pioneer that you can really play. There's like dozens of decks in the format, truly, if you dig down and look at what people do play. But of these decks, I think Greasefang being the one that is trying to be good against green, but also has a good matchup against the card Bone Crusher Giant, which is usually the card that beats the decks that beat green, is what sets it apart.
Yeah, I agree. I also think one thing we kind of talked about for the RC and didn't end up really fleshing out enough, so I think does have some merit, is I think there's a lot of work being done on Greasefang in order to solve the hate cards and the threats presented to you in an efficient way. So like, how many Raven Fieldments do I play versus how many Fractures versus how many Terra Sunders versus how many Abrupt Decays, right? Like that sort of thing is a big part of figuring out Greasefang right now. But I think there's a reasonable amount of space to be like, okay, this was my game one deck. I'm going to need some out of that stuff we just talked about, but can I pivot away from these Parhelions and play more of a real game somehow? And we've seen some out of this with players playing more Sky Sovereigns in the main deck. So they have kind of a middle artifact vehicle to hit off Greasefang that plays a fair game pretty well. But I think in general, sideboarding like that is underexplored, and it's weird going to an open decklist tournament like, hey, am I supposed to have a pivot plan they can kind of see? Will they see it? Like if they read it?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's a weird spot to be in.
I think that effect is also kind of why the Abzan Greasefang deck has been the build. Like a lot of people talked about Esper Greasefang or Mardu Greasefang earlier on in the format, but Essex's Chariot specifically is kind of that card that gives you a pivot plan against things like Graveyard Hate that traditionally shut the deck down, and it does line up really well. But there is a lot of talk when people talk about, is open deck list better or worse, because they're scouting versus, there's no innovation. This is one of the spaces where you could really have an innovative, clever plan and get away with it for an event. And then, of course, once the event's over, everyone kind of knows, and you have to go back to the drawing board and how you're going to kind of juke people. But that doesn't really exist in the same way, because you're never gonna catch anyone kind of when they're not looking, not being prepared for whatever you're about to do.
Fang, another good deck for sure. Phoenix was the next deck we wanted to talk about. It's funny, we mentioned at the beginning of the show some play draw stuff with Phoenix and Rakdos and whatnot. I think the Phoenix deck is pretty good. The Phoenix deck strikes me as Rakdos, but with a better green sideboard plan and kind of a worse plan versus some other decks, where if the cards Stroke and Aether Gust line up well against what you're doing, and what you expect to see the most of, then Phoenix kind of fits that role of being the interactive deck that kind of plays that middle ground you mentioned pretty well. But the Phoenix deck does have like kind of a real weakness in the head-to-head against Rakdos midrange. So I don't know. It's kind of my like number 2 back pocket choice. I got it right here, sleeved up, ready to go for the RC if I wanted to. But it is not clear to me that it is 100% like actually better than playing Rakdos if you want to do that sort of thing. And the sideboard cards are good, but if they don't line up well, you are running into some things like the hate that people are bringing for Greasefang and stuff like that. And the deck has done better in the last couple of weeks, and people have learned it's good, so there's more eyes on it. So I don't know how you feel about all this.
I think that Phoenix has so much room to be customized and explored in a similar vein to Rakdos, but people have spent less time doing it because of how many options there are. But I would say that Phoenix is a Parmesan deck. You know what I mean, Mason? It's got access to some Parmesan in the form of like a Thing in the Ice and Temporal Trespass and some Phoenixes, or just even just Phoenix alone is an angle that you get access to, where sometimes you just have draws that present a clock way faster than anyone would be able to deal with, and that's backed up by removal that answers the threats in the early part of the game. And so something that Rakdos struggles with is getting the game to a point where it has to kind of spend a lot of its time and mana, presenting answers to things that the opponent's doing, and then it kind of has to develop how it's going to win the game.
Mm-hmm.
Arclight Phoenix lets Phoenix focus on how I'm interacting, especially with Mono Green. I'm going to, use a Spikefield Hazard and a Fiery Impulse to kill your Old Growth Troll so it's exiled, or even just pick off your Llanowar Elves and set up and buy time and start putting pressure on you because threats are so much cheaper. And it gets like Arclight Phoenix for free without actually spending mana on it. So it's interacting and developing at the same time. Really, really matters in that matchup. But at the same time, you lose out on having kind of the raw power and the quality of interaction you get over the course of a really long game definitely dwindles, and your reliance on your graveyard is a much more exploitable weakness out of the Phoenix deck. So I think that it really depends on what it is you're trying to do, but this deck it's not as controlling maybe as Rakdos is, where Rakdos is just trying to play really fair, spend mana on all the things it's doing, and then be ahead on all the resource exchanges. It's trying to kind of muscle through and get a few big bursts in cheap to make up for the fact that it might have to 2-for-1 itself on a card every now and then because it doesn't have the same quality of answer that Rakdos does. And in some matchups that matters, but in a lot of them, right now at least, it hasn't been mattering.
I also think, talking about the Rakdos v Phoenix matchup, and it was interesting to hear you say you were having some trouble with it. My experience has been game 1, Phoenix pretty far ahead. Like, not like a significant amount, but like favored, having the card like Treasure. If the card Treasure Cruise resolves, that puts you really far ahead, I think, in a lot of games. And we saw that play out when Misplaced Ginger played against Canister on stream. And then those two kind of played like a 5-set match or 5-match set, and then got on the call and talked for a little bit. And basically what they landed on, which I think is right, is that if the card Treasure Cruise resolves, the advantage bar moves towards the Izzet Phoenix player. And then post board, it is just really hard to resolve the card Treasure Cruise. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the actual thing that matters in the game is much more than Treasure Cruise is pieces of the puzzle, because it is a raw card advantage spell that it enables Treasure Cruise, but also it's the way you're really finding those Phoenixes, the way that you're setting up to have the resources to continue to slog through whatever Rakdos is doing, because that's how you're finding your spells and you're finding your mana for the cruises, which, especially in game 1, are not getting shut down. And then in the post-board games, I personally have approached them, and it's kind of changed. It really depends on how the Phoenix player is approaching it. But as Rakdos, what I've found to be an effective strategy is to try to attrition out all of the threats rather than trying to play a game that is kind of mid-ranging with both of them, really assuming the role of control. And sure, some of that involves like playing out Graveyard Trespassers and Sheoldreds, and if they go unchecked, you're definitely becoming the aggressor in the game. But when you have cards like Extinction Event, and you have access to Go Blank and your discard spells to keep them from entering kind of stage 2 of the game, where they've resolve the pieces and then can set up for a Treasure Cruise, or they're just able to build a graveyard and resolve a cruise and hang with you into the mid to late game because of that extra burst of cards. When you're able to keep them from doing that, then like anything really across the finish line. But in the games where that doesn't happen, you really need to be focused on how are you winning the big picture. And by focusing on the big picture, and part of being on the draw is denying the resource and allowing yourself to play like, 2 Go Blanks and your Duresses and your Thoughtseizes, all having that all in your deck without going down too many cards to actually do something in the game. Like, that was a big part of the motivation for us, was that if you have the discard spells, you really just want to give yourself the most opportunity to catch a pieces of the puzzle in the early game before they're able to kind of spiral out of control with their Treasure Cruises. And pieces was the big card, more so than Treasure Cruise. Because 3 random cards is a lot, but if none of those cards are like the 5 cards that you get to see and picking 2 of them and bidding 3 of them is just so much more value in the way the games play out.
I think we're pretty similar on a lot of it. But yeah, that was interesting to hear. Hopefully that's helpful. If you were a Rakdos or a Phoenix player and curious about that matchup, it's been a high value episode. The last couple decks to talk about here, I think, are ones that if you weren't paying close attention to Pioneer the last few weeks might catch you off guard. And you might even think our memes are the first one. But I'll start off here, the Angels deck. I don't think this is a meme, Abe. I did commentary for the NRG circuit, and we had someone win the 5K with the Angels deck. And I said it on stream, and I think some of the people thought I was just doing the hype up thing, which you're going to hype up any deck that wins, I think, on coverage that's fair. But the Angels deck is very good at being an evasive aggro deck, so you can fly over the top of the mono green deck and kind of just kill them that way, and then gain so much life and has basically unblockable in other aggro matchups, where the Angels deck just sort of like trumps things like mono white, where if you're hitting each other for the same amount of damage, but I'm gaining 6 life a turn cycle, how do you ever win that race? So I think the Angels deck is very good and a totally reasonable choice going into the Pioneer RCQs right now.
Yeah, I think that, like, and the next stuff we'll talk about kind of plays in this too, but I think that Angels, in the same way that Spirits in Modern, like 3 or 4 years ago, was a deck that, like, the fact it took to the air made it so it was the only deck you could really play that was trying to attack on that angle of putting a bunch of tribal stuff into play, having a big air force, and then had a little bit of interaction. In this case, life gain really is kind of the interaction of the format, and because by having flying creatures, you can kind of pressure the unfair accesses of, like, mono green. If you have some flying creatures, maybe you're not able to outrace the combo, but you're going to force them to, like, you're going to outrace their ability to untap with their planeswalkers in the turn. And that can be really, really important, in the same way that by just having a bunch of creatures that gain a bunch of life and have flying, you're going to trump a bunch of the aggro decks that are just playing creatures on the board. And like we're talking about with Gruul, one of the biggest strengths of Gruul is that it has a bunch of big creatures that are resilient to the removal in the format. They line up really well against that. And then they have, like, Sky Sovereign to kind of put them over the top if they need it. So they have a bunch of independently good cards. Angels has a similar set of individually good cards that then have a little more synergy and naturally go over the top of the Gruul deck and kind of can sidestep everything the Gruul deck's trying to do of, like, okay, yeah, you attack me with a Lovestruck Beast. I'll just take it, and then, you know, because I have a Bishop of Wings and I have another Angel in my hand, I'll just gain all of that back, and you have no way to really stop me because your Lovestruck Beast on the ground doesn't do anything to keep me from racing you, which is, like, a big draw of the Gruul deck in how it handles a lot of the aggressive matchups. So, yeah, I think Angel's really well positioned. It was another deck that performed really, really well in Philadelphia. I think it was 2 copies in the top 8. Maybe
2 in the top 8, and Ivan Esperino got 15th with it.
Yeah,
so missing top
yeah, it was like
breakers.
it was one of the last. I think it was the last undefeated deck. It was like definitely. It was going. It was making a really, really deep run on day 1, and I know that it did really well on day 2 as well. And I think it did really well in the 5K on Sunday as well. So it's a deck that's, like, stock has been rising because I think that all of the decks, the other decks in the format, don't really have good answers to what it's doing, and structurally it's just linear and powerful enough that the things it's doing line up well. I do think the mono green matchup is probably not as good as it looks, but like I said, having access to a bunch of flying creatures means that you can get past a single Cavalier. Like, sure, you have to lose one of your creatures, but your Angels can get so big because of cards like Giada or Youthful Valkyrie just getting big, or Righteous Valkyrie giving your team +2/+2, that a 5/6 reach, which normally is a death knell for any deck trying to attack in the air, you can afford to attack into it, and that really changes the dynamic a ton.
Yep, I agree. Let's talk about the Gruul deck. You mentioned some there. The Gruul vehicle deck, we haven't seen it. It's like 8 elves, some of the best 3-drops we've seen in a while, and like Reckless Stormseeker, Lovestruck Beast, Bonecrusher Giant, vehicles, and some removal. That's the deck. Everyone calls it Gruul vehicle. I call it Gruul midrange. Do you have anything you want to say about it, Abe? I know you mentioned about some there a second ago. We're talking about, like, what Angels is doing, but I wanted to let you finish your thoughts if you had any.
Yeah, I think that the Gruul deck, if you play it, I mean, it wound up winning the 30K in Philly, and I think that it's one of those decks that feels really bad when you play it, but all the things it's doing are really good. It really is just a pile of good statted cards, good efficient threats in the format, and like we said at the top of this topic, putting decks to the test is a real thing. And if your deck is doing something linear and powerful and you're forcing your opponent to not be stumbling or not being unable to present the right answers to your questions, then this deck is good because it does exactly that to so much of the format. I do think that more people should play more copies of the Crone War. That card is really messed up, and I think that with all the decks that are kind of seeing rising stock right now, with the exception of maybe Arclight Phoenix, the Crone War is really good against all of them. And so that would be a card that if I was going to be interested in Gruul, I would try to make sure I play at least 2 copies of. The full 4 might be too much. You probably want access to them, but at least 2 copies in the main deck, because I think that it's just one of the best cards in the format for the Gruul deck.
Yeah, the Gruul deck, I think Abe did a great job there. Like, when you play it, sometimes it isn't super impressive if you look at things just like what your cards are doing, but how they line up and interact with the rest of the format makes it much more appealing. And deck's just pretty reasonable and strong, and it's proactive, and it has the best start, like we talked about earlier with the 8 elves, where sometimes you just go like elf into Reckless Stormseeker into a Seeker's Chariot, and you just kill people. They just kind of fall over. And that is powerful. Winning the game and taking over something like that is really strong, and you're able to actually grind against decks like Rakdos. It's funny, Abe, I think a lot of people think it has like an amazing green matchup. I don't think that's the case. I think it just has elves and some flying creatures, in the form of Sky Sovereign and a couple of Crone Wars or whatever, and can kind of break through sometimes, but it isn't like the Atarka deck where like that deck like beats up the mono green deck. I think this deck much more like, yeah, I've got biggish creatures. Lovestruck Beast is bigger than Old Ghost Troll. I can kind of attack you a little bit. So
yeah, it's got plans for that matchup, and a Crone War I think is a big part of that. I think if you don't have that card, it's a lot harder. But it's definitely one of those decks where every time I've lost to it, kind of like thought to myself, like, how did I lose that game? Like, where did it all go wrong? And the answer is always, in my head, it just comes down to Lovestruck Beast is really big, and like Reckless Stormseeker gave a Giganta haste or something after I thought I had the game stabilized, and that was just a lot of damage. And so it's hard to discount just the effectiveness of creatures on rate, and you'll win a lot of games that it feels like, even to your opponent, like they shouldn't have lost, quote unquote, just because your cards were the good cards at attacking.
Well, we want to talk about open deck list a little bit, because we know for a lot of listeners, this might be your first time playing an open deck list tournament. And, hey, it's like a newer thing in the history of Magic, probably the last 3 or 4 years. All the top REL tournaments have been open deck lists, but it wasn't that way for a long time. And Abe, do you have any tricks or tips to help people out open deck list?
Yeah, so
any thoughts?
This was something that actually brought me a ton of success when there was the Lotus Box series on MTG Melee, and also on the SCG online tour a few years ago, was just taking the time to and developing the skill, because it really is a skill that helps a lot in Magic. Something that I got from just reading deck list dump articles and reading all the deck lists that I could see on Goldfish, and then piecing together like, how does this deck handle this problem? But looking at it from, okay, I can see my opponent's deck. How are they going to sideboard against me? What am I going to need to be prepared for? And looking at that, how should I sideboard against them? It's like taking an open note test. When you have access to that information, it gives you so much more to work with to make sure you're not missing anything in your like last couple of sideboarding choices of, oh, do I want more copies of this or more copies of that? Like, should I have this counter magic or should I have this removal spell? Those questions kind of answer themselves once you put yourself in the mindset of, okay, I'm my opponent. I think my opponent's deck list clearly shows they have a plan to do something against me. What exactly is that plan? The numbers probably map pretty clearly if you're playing against someone at the RC who has put in time to prepare. So it should be pretty clear cut to what's going to come out and what's going to come in. Then think about what is it you're going to do to beat that. I think that if you do that every round that you see your opponent's deck list and the player is playing the RC, you will find that it is a lot less stressful to kind of know what is supposed to be playing around, navigate the whole game from the top down, and that will really, really help you.
Yeah, that was the big thing I was going to emphasize. Is sometimes when you're playing, you get in these spots where you've hit the unlosable stake portion of the game, and it's like, okay, I'm going to afford them an extra, let's say 1% to win the game by playing in a way to beat X card, right? Even though it's like a card that maybe you haven't seen yet, but it's reasonable for them to have their sideboard or something like that. But when you know their whole sideboard, it's like, oh, I don't need to worry about Spell Pierce. They have 2, and there's 2 in the graveyard, or something along those lines. And so you can kind of play with a lot more impunity and just sort of do your thing you're trying to do. So I agree with Abe's thing there. Just kind of look at it. And if you're unsure too, maybe like you haven't had the most time in the world to prepare, right? Because some people just have busy lives. You just don't have time to prepare for the RC, but you qualified and you kind of want to do a GP weekend thing, see your favorite podcast host, Mason Clark. And so you go out to the RC, and you're like, what am I supposed to do? Look at the deck list and also think about like, what would I like for them not to bring in against me? And what would I like for them to see them play? Right. And that's a good way to kind of know what might be changing in the deck, right? Where it's like, oh, if they cast a lightning axe, I really don't care. But if they cast, Thing on the Ice, I'm really annoyed. That might be a hint as to what they're trying to do. It might not always line up. There might be reasons why they kept in something or didn't do something. They might not even draw those cards, but you can kind of get a good idea there. So hopefully that's helpful. And the other thing is 2-day events. I know this probably sounds silly if you played Magic for a really long time through COVID and everything, but it is hard to understate how much of a boom we've had actually during COVID. Arena did a lot of good for getting players into the ecosystem, and we have a lot of new blood. And for 2-day events, Abe, I don't want to make this the drink water, eat a banana, get good night's sleep article that, everyone's written or whatever and every podcast has done. But
I said not me ever.
Not me yet. Maybe this week I'll do it. I kind of got a busy week. I cash it in, but that is important stuff. And I just want to take a minute to talk about sort of that. And I know for some players, it's actually very stressful, the idea of playing like, if you do well at the RC, right, Abe, and you're live for getting a Pro Tour invite or even top 8 in the event, you're going to play 15 rounds of Magic, which is a lot of Magic in a weekend. When a lot of things like the NRG circuit, even playing out their entire top 8 in one day, is only 9 to 10 rounds.
Yeah, I think that this is where the ability to focus only on the Magic you're playing and just think about the matches and not anything else really gets put to the test the most, but also shows the most value. Because it is really mentally taxing to play that much Magic, and especially when you're thinking about all your games, but it gets even more taxing when you start to let the other factors of what's on the line and, what else is going on around me start to bleed in and overthink things. And you really just want to make sure that, just like any other weekend, like if you're someone who plays back-to-back RCQs on the weekends, you probably have played 15 rounds of Magic in a weekend before, even with the same deck. And it's not actually that much different than that. But be sure to pace yourself and only really focus on the game that you're playing every time. And I think that's like the best advice I can give you. As far as 2-day events go, the other thing I want to say is that we talk about a winner's metagame a lot, or at least we used to back when there were more 2-day events. A winner's metagame is when, it's what is going to be winning at the end of X amount of rounds, what is going to really rise to the top. In a 2-day event, they're designed such that really does happen. 15 is a lot of rounds for a reason. And so when you're thinking about preparing and you're thinking about that famous 15th sideboard card, I would think about being in the situation where you're playing the last round, you're playing against other decks that are also towards the cream of the crop, you're playing for that invite to the Pro Tour. What is the most likely thing that matchup's going to be? What is going to be in the winner's metagame? Because that is actually what's important, and how much churn there is to get there. Like, what's really going, like, obviously green and red black, the two de facto best decks, they're going to have a good day one. They're going to do well. Are they going to do well on that second day of now testing it again against that field? What's really going to rise to the top there is a question that I try to ask myself, and I think really does serve me well to do so.
100%. I think that was great. The last thing we just have here is enjoy yourself. The RC is like, it's a thing that a lot of people worked really hard and tried to get to, and not everyone gets to play the RC, but it is also kind of a fun experience. Well, it should be a fun experience if it's been like other Magic tournaments like it. And you're going to be playing against a lot of people, who are like, love the game just like you, people you maybe seen online or heard of or, met before or anything like that. And it's just going to be a fun time, and just enjoy yourself. Like, it is important, and it is cool. I should say this: it is cool to care about things, and it is cool to like want to do well and put a lot of drive in that. But don't let the weekend and the experience pass you by in the goal of doing that. Especially maybe once the dreams may be dead for making it to the Pro Tour or whatever, where you don't make day 2. You still have a bunch of Magic ahead of you potentially, because there are, I think it's a Pioneer 10K or 15K on Sunday. So like there's still that you could play too. So blah blah. There's a lot going on. So
yeah, I think I also want to say a big part for me of enjoying myself at these events is getting to meet new people and connect with new people who also love Magic. And if you're someone who feels like they don't really have as strong a network of players who really take Magic as seriously as they want to, every player you play against at the RC is someone who qualified for the RC. That's every time. That's an opportunity for you to connect with someone and have an experience with someone that is possibly as excited about the idea of playing competitive Magic as you are, and is interested in, growing their network of people that they can talk to about ideas and test with. So if you have someone who you play a really fun match against, you both have a good time, you're both really enjoying yourself, that's a great opportunity to grow your Magic circle and gain another person who you can talk to about Magic in that way, who is someone who is on that same level as you. And I think especially if you're someone who listens to this podcast and is really interested in that, really wants to get all that insight and wants to expand their knowledge and wants to learn and grow, that is possibly one of the biggest things you could get out of enjoying yourself at this event, is meeting friends who you can talk about with Magic. That's something that I got a ton of through my time grinding PTQs, or then, SCGs and playing the Pro Tour. Like all of that, the biggest thing that was value add for me and enjoying myself was the people, to the gathering.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's gonna do it for our main topic today. Hopefully this was helpful for you for the RC, and if you have any other solar events, hopefully the Pioneer talk was useful. Maybe you end up playing old San Diego here in I think it's like April, so maybe you just get to re-listen to some of these later parts for that. But that's gonna do it for our main topic. We do have our Patreon question. Patreon is a way to support the show. It's always gonna be free, but you can give back. And one of the cool things about being a patron is you get to ask questions. You might get yours run the show. We have a question from Yeoman this week, Abe. And the question is, what's the deck you wish you had time before the RC to delve into more fully? There's an interesting question, too, because our Canadian friends and stuff, their RCs, they do have more time. It's really just me in this equation that doesn't have more time.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the deck that if I had a Hyperbolic Time Chamber and I could spend a year just doing whatever, trying to figure out this deck, and it would take only a day, I would go in there and I would figure out the Enigmatic Incarnation deck. I think that there's so much to do there, and there's so many chains and so many unexplored ideas that deck can really change. I'm not even sure that and this might be blasphemous, I'm not even sure that Fire's Invention is very good in the deck anymore.
Yeah, I also wonder if the weirdly clunky card that opens up double spelling is not what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I actually want to build my deck so that I'm trying to just double spell a bunch of things, because a bunch of my things at a certain point, now the way the deck's built, so many of the things are just 2 mana, and they're trying to get a 3 mana card, or they're like Fable, which is generating value, and then you get a 4 mana card. But I'm not really doing anything for that much mana, or trying to do 2 expensive things that often. And now that deck's playing Wolfwillow Haven, there's just so much. There's so much to explore there. There's so much to dig into. And I think the Enigmatic Incarnation just presents such a neat puzzle that it has to be the deck that needs the most exploration, and that's where I wish I could have spent more time.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think along that same line of Hyperbolic Time Chamber 1 year and a day, it might be Phoenix, and really just spending a lot of time exploring all the different sideboard ways to Phoenix. Because for example of cards I've talked about playing in my sideboard for this weekend are as many great cards as Hall of the Storm Giants number 3 and 4, Hazoret, Keranos. The list goes on and on. I can't remember the names of cards right now, but there have been a lot of things. I think some of them more explored than others, but it's oh, what if we did things like this? And that's not even getting into stuff like we mentioned on earlier. It's okay, am I supposed to be taking the draw in this matchup? Let's figure this out. How am I supposed to sideboard? Am I supposed to take all my Phoenixes out in this matchup? I think I am. And so I think that'd be a deck where, like Abe mentioned, it hasn't had as much time on it to explore as fully as something like Rakdos has had, and it hasn't had a misplaced Ginger outside of like Nathan Stewart, our world champion, and he kind of just plays it for the big of it and then drops it every time. He like qualifies for the Mox, plays at the Mox, and then he just doesn't play it again. And every time he does it, the deck moves forward a good bit, but we don't have someone championing that deck all the time.
Yeah, we don't have someone putting in the 10,000 hours that Misplaced Ginger puts in.
And that is like important to a deck. And, you know, there are times where I've, you know, at the beginning of like back in June, I talked about like just play Phoenix like all the time and really learn it. But there are lots of reasons not to play decks for that whole time. And like personally, it's like, well, I've got to look at like a lot of decks. I got to make content or whatever. And so I really wish I had more time to explore the Phoenix deck and kind of know, and like really know. But I think that is the one. Either that or the did you see the Indomitable Creativity deck I tweeted out this weekend?
Was it the blue-red Creativity deck? Because I've seen that deck a lot.
So it was a blue-red Portal to Phyrexia's Creativity deck that's Jeskai with Refurbish. And then you sideboard into the other combo. And so you're just a control deck that portals to Phyrexia, kills their stuff, and just kills them with their own things.
But what if they just don't have anything?
Oh, that's part of the problem. That is, I mean, here's the thing. This idea's been in my head, and I've been really busy with a lot of stuff going on in life, and had the RC, and I don't know how to solve these problems. So if I had more time, I could look into this. But my current solution to your question, Abe, is I have Xenagos and Worldspine War on my sideboard. And I bring those back in, and I have like a transformational sideboard. But if they just don't have creatures, my plan is simply to lose. I can't beat everything in Pioneer.
Yeah.
Like, unironically.
I'll see about renting some Hyperbolic Time Chamber place, and then I'll let you figure that out.
All right, nice. Yeah, if you could look into it, that'd be really helpful. But yeah, thank you so much, Roman, for that question. Another way to get a question is to go to youtube.com/ccmtg. We don't have a YouTube question this week, unfortunately, from all that. But Spencer's not here on the show this week, and he kind of put in the Patreon Discord he'd like for us to guess what deck we think he would like the Hyperbolic Time Chamber on. And so, Abe, what do you think is the Pioneer deck that Spencer wishes he had more time to test?
This is tough. So, there's two leading candidates for me.
That's how I feel, too.
And they're two different things that I know Spencer loves. One would be for him to really get a chance to go deep on the Atarka ramp deck, because I know he really loves that deck, and I also feel that he could always spend more time doing it, and he would love to do so. Two would be the Indomitable Creativity decks, because I feel like he really, really likes that scape-shifty vibe of resolving a 4-mana sorcery or a 5-mana sorcery that wins the game instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the closest thing you have in the format. And so, yeah, that's my
I like where your head's at. Yeah, I agree with the first one. The second one, I had the mono-white Yorion deck just because Spencer kept mentioning cards from Brothers War last week on the show about it. But after hearing the thing about creativity, then it does fit his vibe way more than the mono-white control deck. See, I think Spencer thinks he likes the idea of the mono-white Yorion control deck. I just don't think he actually is going to like playing it, where it's like, he's going to get stuck in the Hyperbolic Time Chamber one weekend and be like, what was I thinking? I have Charming Prince, the Raven Inspector in front of me on a table for the next year, you know? And like, I'm flickering them with Yorion to try and set up some value. So those are my two guesses. But for the sake of locking one in, I'm going to trust him to be honest for the sake of, you know, shot calling rights. I'm going with Yorion.
Okay, and I'm locking in the creativity deck. Because I think there's a lot of room for some 1s and 2s and 3s and all that. And that is Spencer. As far as I can tell, that is Spencer's favorite thing about Magic. So
yeah, Spencer does love 1s and 2s.
It's what 3s and 4s are made of, Mason.
He can't get to a 4 without a couple 2s.
That's just the God honest truth about math, Mason.
I love the idea of that, like your grandma's throw pillow. It's just like, can't get to 4 O's without a couple 2 O's on the way. But yeah, so it's curious to see. We'll have to see next week. We're gonna have a little breakdown episode. We're gonna go over some of the RC stuff a little bit, I think, and or at least in part. And so we'll have to see when we get there what Spencer would answer. So look forward to that next week on the show. Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
Find me at twitter.com/morenothings. That is where I tweet. And until Twitter dies a glorious death at the hands of our Lord Elon Musk on Twitter, that's where you'll find me. When that happens, I'll have to find somewhere else to, push my thoughts and accept coaching inquiries. So how about you, Mason?
Yep, you can find me over at twitter.com @Mason E. Clark. I am going down with the ship until Twitter is, it's like the old, like, if there is a fan, it is I thing. Till Twitter is burning on fire. I'm going down with the ship there. So you can find me over there. You can find me over at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. If you want to inquire about coaching, you can message me on Twitter, like we mentioned, or you can email me, masoneclark@gmail.com. Find me there, and you can inquire about coaching. I have a couple spots opening up, and with the RC ending or / happening, I am now having more slots reopen. Had to bunker down a little bit to test, but I got some more time slots. So if you're looking for that, hopefully that can be helpful for you. And that is basically it outside of Card Kingdom, where I have an article each and every Thursday, and almost forgot for a second. But yeah. Oh yeah, and I guess you can see me. I can announce this too. I'm doing more NRG coverage. We kind of mentioned it last week on the show. Had my debut with them 3 weeks ago at the time which you'll hear this, I think, or 2 weeks. But I'm going to be doing coverage for the Mundelein NRG. So, if you like Magic and you like commentary or paper Magic, go check that out. And, make sure to say nice things about me. That way Norm keeps inviting me back. But thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of CCMTG. We'll see you all next week for another episode.